record this. And it is, I believe it's recording. Yeah, it's recording. Perfect. Okay, so when we define trauma, I like the definition of any event that overwhelms a person's ability to respond to it emotionally, cognitively, spiritually, and physically. And the next slide will go into specifically what that means. And so if you have heard, in the United States, there was a long study called the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study that took place in the mid-90s with the Centers for Disease Control and Kaiser Permanente here. And they followed children who had experienced childhood trauma over the duration of their adulthood. And they took a lot of measures of their physical health, their cognitive health, and also how they did economically and with their jobs. And that's where the data showed that we have to expand what we mean by trauma, because we often think of it as sexual assault, war, or a natural disaster, those big, they call, as people say, big T trauma. And yet we also know that for kids witnessing or experiencing domestic violence, having a parent with a mental illness, those are also traumatic events. So the ACEs study really expanded what we know about trauma. And they're still following those individuals over the duration of their life, which is interesting to see what happens. The impacts of trauma are not linear and they can be long lasting. So what I mean by linear is that people often think of war, for example, or a natural disaster being the worst type of trauma that you can experience. So that would mean they're expecting someone to show more symptoms of trauma. That's simply not the case because, as we'll talk about today, everyone's brain is wired so differently. And so what you experience is not correlating necessarily to the amount of trauma that you'll experience after that. So just as healing is not linear, the experience of trauma is not linear. So I often rely on people to tell me what the impacts of their trauma are instead of me assuming what they're experiencing after a certain traumatic event. Okay, so types of trauma. I just listed a bunch that might seem like it's intuitive and then some that might be not so intuitive. So as I mentioned, natural disasters, war, physical, emotional, mental, spiritual, or sexual abuse, like Safa, you mentioned that. Witnessing or experiencing violence in the home. We have poverty and the impacts of that. Accidents, for example, grief related to loss. I think the two that is gaining more awareness now, and most of this work has been done by people of color, is racial trauma and intergenerational trauma. So, Miriam, I forgot to ask you where you live. So I don't want to assume you're in the United States. I know Safa's in Canada, and that's where I'm from too. Bermuda, perfect. So you are far away from what is happening in North America. And I'm sure but Bermuda has its own challenges as well with oppression and racism. So as you probably heard with the Black Lives Matter movement, racism has been a part of this country and Canada and others for centuries. And we're only now seeing people really recognize that it causes trauma. And when we talk about intergenerational trauma, for example, Black Americans often speak about their family members and ancestors being part of the slavery trade that took place and how genetically that's passed down through generations of families, as well as with Indigenous people, both in Canada and the United States and everywhere else. Like that trauma is in your genetics and it gets passed down. So this kind of expands, hopefully, how we see trauma, and also understanding that trauma-informed yoga as a field has been really carved out by mostly white people. And so the way they define trauma is the first three: natural disasters, war, and let's say sexual assault. And so even the resources I'll recommend have been authored by white people. And I will say that a lot of people of color are actually bringing in more Eastern and holistic methods of therapy and trauma-informed yoga that it's not being done by people who are white or Caucasian. So that's something to be aware of. So it can be hard to see statistics in terms of what people are experiencing. And the reason why I think it's important is if you think about a yoga studio, and let's say you have about 12 to 15 students in your space, I often think to myself as an instructor, how many of these individuals have experienced trauma and they're coming to a mainstream studio and I'm teaching them. So as we know, 1 in 4 women will probably be sexually assaulted in their lifetime. Child sexual abuse rates are pretty high, 1 in 4, 1 in 6. 1 in 4 individuals will experience intimate partner violence. So that means whether it's in a dating relationship, whether it is 2 partners together in a home, like they're living together. We know that 1 in 5 Americans and Canadians will have mental illness. And so that does impact how trauma manifests. BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, people of color, have increased rates of violence and all forms of oppression. And you have to also think about people who identify as LGBTQ as well, that's also impacting their trauma and what they face, and that there is intergenerational trauma. So if you think about a studio, a class with 12 to 15 people, you can assume that at least 25 to 30% are coming into the studio with trauma, if not more, and that oftentimes it's not manifesting. So we have to come with the lens of being trauma informed and finding ways to do that in all types of our yoga classes, because we don't need someone to tell us that they have experienced trauma necessarily. So when we talk about trauma, I think it's important to understand what happens when trauma occurs. As we know, our brain is wired for survival. So if we think about what our brain needs for us to survive, it's to remember events that are harmful, so that if they happen again, we are protected from them because we will jump into action. So the brain, that's all it cares about. It cares about helping us survive. And research has shown that there's a 6-week processing period for the brain after a traumatic event. So I used to work in schools. And so, for example, let's say that I was in one high school one time and a student took their own life. And so there was a 6-week period that we have to consider in terms of people's brains making sense of that, whether they're close to that student or whether they are in school and knew what was going on. Now, during that 6-week period, it's really important that we give people time and space to process what's happening without forcing it. So when things like assemblies were held to talk about suicide and mental health, when students were forced to talk about their experiences, during that 6-week period, it's really problematic to do that because we need the brain to be able to understand what's happening without interference. Because the more that we talk about and process something verbally during those 6 weeks, the more it can amplify how trauma is experienced after that time. And so we want to have offerings that people can choose to engage in, like they can choose to see a counselor if they want to talk to, they can choose to go to a vigil or an event, but they're not being forced to do it. Because multiple factors will influence how the brain remembers trauma. And so it's something to consider if you have a friend or a loved one who's experienced something, that you might be offering them ways to give them support, but you're not forcing it, because we want to be able, sorry. My AirPod fell out and I'm actually, I think it's fine. You can still hear me, right? Okay. I'm having issues with my ears. That's why they're falling out. So yeah, it's just important that we're not forcing any one from participating in something they don't want to after they've experienced trauma, which can be hard to do when we care about someone. All right. So in terms of how trauma is stored in the brain's response to trauma is to create really strong memories. So how that happens is the lower part of the brain, which I'll show an image, it's called the limbic system, and that's where our emotional responses are stored, and that part of our brain is not readily accessible by our conscious thought. So what happens is traumatic memories are strongly tied to emotion, and they're stored in something called a trauma capsule. And that little capsule is different than where other long-term memories are stored, because the brain needs to remember this critical information in case trauma happens again. So it's readily accessible. So the trauma capsules are stored in the amygdala, which is a word that means almond, and it is in our lower brain center, and the amygdala controls emotions such as fear and such as anger. So it's very unconscious. The hippocampus, which plays a role in memory, and the hypothalamus and the brainstem, which are all lower parts of the brain. So a trauma capsule is stored in an inaccessible place. Emotions are strongly tied. So these parts of the brain are not accessible. So when we talk about triggering, which we will today, it's not something that's easily controlled without training the brain to control triggers from happening. And so what happens is memories of trauma, because they're stored in this capsule, they may not ever be completely known by an individual because the brain and body will remember what's helpful. And because it's not accessible by our thinking parts of our brain, when you ask someone what happened and they don't tell you all the details, or they tell you different details, or the story slightly changes, it's literally because they don't know, and they might have trouble accessing their trauma capsule. So it's not an intentional thing of that they're lying or that they're like not wanting to tell you, it's that they literally can't. And so the body and the brain remembers for survival. And I think somehow it might just be the way God has designed our brain, is that maybe we don't need to remember all the details, right? Because what would that do to us if we're always remembering what happened to us, versus our brain just needing to know for survival purposes. Does that make sense to you both? And yeah, okay. If you have any questions, like feel free to stop, because I feel like I talk a lot. So when we talk about the brain, I think you can see my cursor. I'm not going to go into great depth since I'm not a neuroscientist, but this bottom part where it looks like a ball of wool and then the brainstem, that's what we're talking about, lower brain centers. Awesome. So these centers are not accessible by our cognitive thinking, and that's where the trauma capsules will be stored. So inaccessible parts of the brain. The rest of it that looks like all of these, like, what do they call them? I forget the word. Safa, you probably know. I'm like blanking. It's the cortex. Yeah, sulci, or some word for like all of these channels and how it kind of looks like raw meat when we look at a picture of the brain. That's the cortex. So we're going to talk about it. These are higher levels of our brain that is involved in complex thinking, in part of us seeing, hearing, and speaking, moving. And so we'll talk about the relationship between those two, or they can be called bumps. Yeah, I forget the term from my neuroanatomy course. It was a long time ago. Okay, so let's say somebody experiences trauma. We have heard of this notion called fight or flight, which is the sympathetic nervous system, and that springs us into action. And then we have the opposite side, the purple side, which is parasympathetic, rest and digest. So it's kind of like after lunch, you're probably going to hit rest and digest. Fight or flight is, let's say you see a black bear on a hiking trail while you're hiking, your body will probably activate the sympathetic nervous system because it recognizes that there's danger. So that means heart rate's going to increase, adrenaline pumps through your body, digestion shuts down. It's like, let's move blood to your limbs because we need you to actually try and fight, which hopefully you won't do that, or to run away. And so that's what happens during trauma, and it's what happens when you're triggered. And so that's something that we'll talk about coming up in terms of after trauma has been experienced. So there's an awesome book called Complex PTSD, Complex Post-Traumatic Stress Disorder, and I was going to show it, but it's actually downstairs, so I'm not going to run and get it. This is where this information comes from, because when we think about trauma, we often think of 2 to 3 responses, and I just mentioned fight or flight. And there's also a third one that's freeze. So oftentimes we freeze because our body just thinks it's better to just stay there and just endure whatever's happening as a protective mechanism. It's no one's fault if they freeze. It's one of the 4 responses that your body can take. There's actually a 4th one called fawn, and that's what complex PTSD speaks about. So in any situation of trauma, you can either fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. So that means that there's not one way to respond. And so we're going to dig a little bit deeper into what those 4 mean. So fight obviously means when you respond aggressively to something threatening. And again, this is not in completely your conscious control. It depends on your sympathetic nervous system. There's flight. So you're fleeing, you're dissociating, you're running away. There is freeze, so your body and brain realize that resistance is not going to work, so the body gives up and it numbs out and it dissociates to protect you, and that so that even though you may be hurt, it's different than when you're not frozen. So it's a dissociation to kind of remove yourself. And then fawn, this happens a lot in situations where there's an abusive relationship. Let's say there's a situation of domestic violence in the home with a partner. A person responds to the threat by trying to be pleasing in order to forestall the attacker. And fawn is something that I think is not often spoken about with trauma. And so it's a response that happens And all four of these also are how triggering can show up in a yoga studio and outside of a yoga studio. So that's going to be something that we'll talk a little bit about, and maybe we'll bring it back next webinar to talk about what that looks like on the yoga mat. Okay, so when we talk about trauma and triggers, triggers is that term that everyone's probably heard when you read an article and somebody says sensitive content, be careful, or just content warning. That's what it means, because even reading something can trigger a trauma response. And so trauma memories can be activated by present events. So Mayuti, your definition of trauma is still living in the hurt of a past experience. That's exactly what a trigger is. Now, the complicated part is that triggers are not necessarily related to the trauma itself. And that's really challenging, because that means as individuals and yoga instructors, the goal of a trauma-informed yoga class is not to prevent any trigger from happening. It's to give people the tools to work through and respond to a trigger that they're experiencing. So I recently taught a class before COVID on a college campus. There was a survivor who came, and she later on after class, she cried and spoke to one of the counselors present, and she had been triggered during class. And she said it wasn't so much the yoga or any of the poses, it was some of the resources that were there afterwards about body image that triggered her, because since her experiencing sexual assault, she'd had a lot of traumatic responses around her body not being in her control, and she had recently gained weight. And so that was something as an instructor I could never have predicted, that a resource on body image could trigger somebody. And so again, the goal is not to prevent triggers, it's really to help people work through them. And realizing that the trigger is a way of protecting someone from trauma, because the brain can't tell that they're in a safe environment, right? It's an automatic response. So a student can be on their mat in child's pose, and the person knows that they're in a safe space, but the brain might be triggered and be like protection mode, survival, and then they activate the trauma response. So that's what's happening when somebody is triggered. So I'm going to throw a few more neurological terms, and this was helpful for me when I took the trauma training I did to understand how there's different responses in this optimal zone. And so when somebody has experienced trauma, there is an optimal zone in the middle where they are able to function, they are remaining grounded, they're in the present moment, and they're feeling safe and present. And then there are two opposite sides of this bell curve that can happen. So hypoarousal, hypo meaning under, arouse is a vagal nerve response. And I won't go into too much detail about the vagal nerve. And I'm sure, Safa, that you have a lot of knowledge about the vagal nerve. But basically when hypoarousal happens, it causes somebody to dissociate and become very lethargic. They withdraw, and they basically have almost like a freeze response. So that's, it's not freeze per se, but it can look like that, because it looks like the person is just withdrawn and that they're not in the present moment. They're immobilized in a way. And then what can happen on the other end is there can be this hyper arousal, hyper meaning more. So that turns somebody into having a fight, flight, or freeze response. So a trigger can actually on a yoga mat cause somebody to start to breathe really rapidly, sweat. They can start to have intrusive thoughts. So any of that can happen on a yoga mat when somebody's triggered. And so the goal of, let's say, trauma-informed yoga or any sort of healing therapy for trauma is to ensure that people have the tools to stay in this optimal arousal zone. So for somebody who is dissociating, and let's say they're hypo-aroused, a therapist or let's say a yoga therapist might help them to get their arousal up a little bit. So when they're dissociating, they're going to give them tools to come back to the present moment by grounding down. Same with somebody who's hyper aroused, right? So breathing really heavily out of their mouth, they're having intrusive thoughts. It's like, okay, tell me 5 things you can see, tell me 4 things you can feel, tell me 2 things you can see. So you're trying to use strategies to bring them back to the middle. And the goal of trauma-informed yoga is to also try and give people tools to come back to the middle. So you might have somebody being immobilized in a class, you might have somebody responding really hyper aroused during half pigeon, for example, and that you know that by your cues, you can bring them back to the middle during a class. So that's the goal of, let's say, trauma-informed yoga and any sort of healing modality. So, one other way to think about this is what happens to the brain during a trauma response. And there is a hormone that I'm sure you've heard of, cortisol. It's the stress hormone. It gets activated in our bloodstream as soon as there's a stressful situation. And so we recognize it because it might give us a stomach ache, a headache, our heart rate increases during stress. That is all normal. Like we all need a certain amount of stress to survive. Otherwise, we'd be just lumpy sacks of body and bone sitting on a chair. So we need some sort of stress to live and survive. Now, what happens on the green side with the green head, under normal flow of information, let's say a survivor is not triggered, they're in a good place in that middle of that curve. Information, let's say, comes in through your eyes and it goes to the occipital lobe, which is in the back of your head. You don't really need to know these names unless you really want to, but you take in information visually, it hits your occipital lobe, and then from there, it goes to the space behind your forehead. This is the frontal lobe, a specific area called the prefrontal cortex, which is the most developed parts of human brain. And that part is super analytical. It's the part that helps us do things like budget and make decisions and think of consequences. So that's why it develops in later adulthood, because teens often lack that knowledge and information. So it goes to the prefrontal cortex, it kind of interprets the information, and then the information goes up to our parietal lobe at the top. And then that part is a lot of like sensory skills are up there. So that's how we respond. So the information is being filtered numerous times before we're responding. So that's why it's the green head. It's because things are under control and they're working in a really healthy way when you're not triggered. Now the red side, when you are stressed, or let's say that you are being triggered, the information still gets taken in and goes to the occipital lobe, but you'll notice that the arrow to the prefrontal cortex is not there. So anytime triggering happens, that lower part of the brain stem with the almond, the trauma capsule takes over, and literally the prefrontal cortex shuts off. So any sort of, let's say you see somebody being triggered and then you're asking them to verbally process, can you tell me what's happening? What are you seeing? What are you hearing? They're not going to be able to respond, because literally all they need to be able to do right now is just breathe and remember that they're in the present moment. They're not in their trauma experience that's happening. So yoga classes take this into account, because what we're doing in yoga classes is teaching people over and over again how to ground, how to breathe, how to stay present. It is not about perfecting your poses. The goal of trauma-informed yoga and all yoga, I believe, is we have to teach people who are in the red how to ground themselves so that they can get back to the green. And this can take a lot of practice, a lot of time. I mean, I'm sure the moment all of us are on our mats as well, we get distracted. So distraction is different from trauma. And the goal is to really give tools to ground and ground using our lower brain centers before we're going to talk to them about how to perfect their warrior two, because their brain's just not going to be there. So when we next session and the third one, when we talk about what trauma-informed yoga looks like, the cues are very different. Even the way we sequence a class is really different. So that takes this red brain into account. You're both good with that information? Cool. Okay, hopefully you're both still awake. Miriam, I hope you're doing well as you multitask. Cool. Oh, Mayuti, my apologies. Awesome. Okay, so this is where I'll get you both to maybe share some info. So based on what we just talked about, how might you be able to tell that a student is triggered during a yoga class? So you can think about this as like physical manifestations, maybe emotional ones. Like what are some signs that you might see from a student who's triggered in your class?
Are we taking turns, or should I just talk?
Yeah, you can talk, because I believe, Mayuti, you're going to be typing, so we can give you some time to type. Yeah.
I like some of the things that you mentioned.
Yeah.
Just especially increased respirate. And
Yeah.
in our training, we did this thing about becoming sensitive energetically. And so sometimes when you're just walking close to somebody, you can actually feel somebody withdraw.
Yes.
And for me in practice, like when I'm with somebody one-on-one, whether it's in treatment or teaching yoga individually, there's sometimes like an obvious dissociating that happens. And so you can actually see it in their face. Like they just, you can, it's almost like they're living in a different place or thinking in a different way.
Mm.
So I don't want to say it's a sense because physically something actually does happen. It's almost like
Yes.
somebody loses affect, like they lose their
Yes.
expression, almost like they're not able to pay attention to you anymore.
Yes. So even though it's a lot of internal triggering or dissociating, you're still going to be able to probably see it because
Mm-hmm.
it is really hard for it not to manifest physically on your mat, right? Like,
Yeah.
so yeah. And then Mayuti, oh, you said you have no idea. So, and that's totally not sure how to see it. Okay. And that makes sense because oftentimes so I don't know if you both see this, but when I teach class, there are always students who might be looking distracted, or there might be students who aren't exactly following what you're teaching. And some of that I say is fine, like go at your own pace. If you don't want to do a pose, don't do it. So it can be really hard to know, is that conscious or is that trauma? So some of the things to maybe that could be signals is like Safa, you said the breath. So kind of this hyperventilating out of your mouth breath during a pose that isn't cardio heavy, for example, right? So maybe seeing someone's respiratory rate increase. I have seen students start to cry on their mat, and that might be something that you can see too as an emotional response. To be honest, I always assume someone in my group is dealing with trauma. Yes. So, and sometimes people might be really good at either not hiding it intentionally, but they just don't show that they are. So I think like both, it can be apparent that somebody's being triggered and it cannot. So I always tend to like circle back with people at the end of class just to check in with how class felt for them. And sometimes that's also not helpful. So it's challenging. So I think the assumption that someone's always dealing with something is a good way to operate, and then
I
giving them
say one more
tools.
thing.
Yeah, go for it.
The other thing that I see in some of my patients, especially I treat a lot of pain and chronic pain, and a lot of my patients, especially if they're accustomed to doing a lot of Ashtanga power type yoga, trauma actually might manifest as hyper perfection.
Yes.
And that is really, really hard to see, but I will always try to be mindful of breath. And because sometimes what happens is they actually stop breathing in order to
Yes.
achieve perfection. So, yeah.
Yes. I really appreciate you saying that because we I don't think we have time to cover it today, but in that complex trauma book
Mm-hmm.
with the 4 Fs,
Yeah.
Pete Walker not only talks about how we respond to trauma, but what happens after is people still show fight, flight, freeze, or fawn responses. So somebody who is a fight person actually has perfectionist tendencies. Somebody who is a fawn person, for example, let's say that they experience violence from a husband or partner, they might actually fawn with the yoga instructor or other students because they want to try and be pleasing. So the 4 Fs are trauma related and then post-trauma related. And so that perfection is very common. And sometimes it's like, oh, A-type personality, overachiever, but it could be a result of trauma. And then Mayuti saying, yes, breath is the great grounding mechanism. Absolutely. And it can be so hard for somebody to learn how to ground through their breath. I have a colleague who cannot take deep breaths. She's only a shallow breather. And as much as I've tried, I just don't know how. So it's just, there's sometimes resistance to that because it's really uncomfortable. So it's amazing how something that's automatic can also be really challenging to address. So thanks for sharing those, and also Mayuti for acknowledging that it can be challenging to know, because it can be challenging to know. I'm sure I know that I've missed trauma showing up. So some other ways that you might be able to see it, either before or after class, is speech function can be impacted. So we talked about how the prefrontal cortex goes offline. We also know that the motor area of speech, which if you like to know, it's called Broca's area, it goes offline. So somebody might have a really hard time forming words and speaking, and that could be because they're triggered and their frontal cortex is offline. We can have the fight, flight, freeze, or fawn response happening. Thought processes might not make sense. So if you're talking to them afterwards, things may not be completely coherent. And again, the prefrontal cortex has gone offline. They may be experiencing flashbacks or dissociation. That can be hard to tell because it can look like zoning out, and sometimes it doesn't either. So there's not always physical manifestations on students' yoga mats. So that can be really challenging. All right, any questions about like the like trauma and brain part? Okay, if not, okay, so I thought we're going to do just a couple slides about mental health, and then we're going to go into the last part because it's 12:45, 10:45, wherever you are in terms of time. And the reason why I think it's important to talk about mental health is because I've often heard a lot of people associate trauma with PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, and assuming that everyone who experiences trauma has PTSD. And so I just wanted to address that because that's not completely true. So when we talk about mental health, I find this in the States happening a lot more than Canada, and I don't know if Mayuti, you find this happening in Bermuda, but mental health is often equated to mental illness. So I'll have people say, oh yeah, she has mental health. And I'm like, we all have mental health. Like, what do you mean by that? So I really like, oh good, Mayuti's saying yes. So mental health, I really like the World Health Organization's definition because it's very holistic. It's a state of well-being where we realize our potential, we can live and work productively, and we can give to our community however we want to. And I really love that definition. It's beyond like the cognitive emotional definition that a lot of practitioners use, for example. And so mental health is a continuum. So what that means is that multiple things can be happening at the same time. And at any point in our life, we fall at different points on this continuum. So on the green side, we have healthy, everything is functioning as it should. And then sometimes we have distress that comes up, and this is okay because we can manage it. So things like feeling nervous, sad, increased worrying, we're procrastinating, we might have a rough night of sleep, we might have less energy, but the brain kind of fluctuates. So in the yellow area, typically things are able to kind of be on this kind of this zone of fluctuation, right? So down and up. And there might be times where you're overly happy and overly optimistic, and then things kind of level off again. When we are injured or ill, that means we often need professional care and support. And so injured and ill means that we have more of a severe impact on our day-to-day functioning. So that means that there is more intensity, and the frequency with which we're experiencing difficulties is more. So a lot of mental illnesses require a certain amount of time to be diagnosed, right? So depression, for example, 2 years of persistent symptoms, which seems like a lot, but yet here people are prescribed antidepressants really early by their physicians. So this is to say that somebody can have mental illness. So let's say we know depression and anxiety are the two most common mental illnesses. Someone can have depression and also be able to function very well, right? So it's not exclusionary, it's simultaneous. Someone can have PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, and they can be functioning really well. And so being in one category is not exclusive of others. It just depends oftentimes on circumstances and the demand that's being placed on somebody. And so this type of language means that we don't see individuals with trauma as having dysfunction. We see them as experiencing difficulty and success, depending on the context. So I just like to kind of say that so that we're not pathologizing people with their illnesses. The illness is not who they are, it's what they're dealing with. So it's separate from that. So these are, I think, what I just said. I just like to put it on a slide when you're reading it later, that so that you can remember. And yes, I did mention those things. Okay, so briefly about post-traumatic stress disorder. I mentioned the 6 weeks of the brain processing trauma. So PTSD is often diagnosed after those 6 weeks. So somebody should not typically be diagnosed within those 6 weeks because there's a processing time. And so post-traumatic stress disorder is a mental illness, a mental health condition that means that the event, so Mayuti, you saying that you're currently living in a past event, that's very much still happening. Symptoms can be flashbacks, nightmares, severe anxiety, as well as uncontrollable thoughts. And so that means the trauma capsule is really activated and it's present in someone's life, more so than being triggered now and then. It is an active part of somebody's functioning. And so it is a diagnosis. And actually, trauma-informed yoga, I believe when, specifically in terms of when certain individuals created that field, came out of work with veterans after war. So they noticed that veterans were coming back with complex post-traumatic stress disorder. And it was two professionals in Boston that started a yoga, trauma-informed yoga program for them. So it came out of PTSD, and since then it's been broadened to address all sorts of trauma that we talked about in that initial slide. Okay, so this is the last part we'll chat about. It will hopefully be a bit more engaging to think about what are students bringing to their mat. So far we have talked about trauma as an individual person who's experienced something. And now I want to add a bit more complexity and say that trauma is actually ecological. And so this is from Bronfenbrenner's ecological model. It's something that I learned about in OT school many, many years ago. And his system talked about like micro system, meso system, macro system. So I just adapted that terminology to be a bit more user-friendly. So individual, family, community, and society. So when we say trauma is ecological, we have a person on their yoga mat. And so yes, we just talked about the brain and what's happening. And they're also experiencing trauma in a system, right? They are part of a family, they're part of a community, and they're ultimately part of a society. So society means the country that we're all from, but also the world is very much connected now. We're all going through the COVID pandemic. So there are things that are uniting us as well. So this means that students are bringing their ecological trauma onto their mats. It's not just their own trauma. And so that complicates things, and it's not our job to address all of that. It's more of like let's try and understand the layers that students are dealing with on their yoga mats with their trauma. So when we talk about individual trauma, in terms of the experience, it can be physical, emotional, spiritual consequences of having lived through a traumatic event. There's also the family, right? So whether that's your biological family or let's say your adopted family, are they supportive or are they amplifying your trauma? Are you actively being triggered by them not being supported, right? People come from their homes to their yoga mat, so they're bringing in that experience with them. Let's think about zooming out and look at community. So given that we are all identifying as Muslim, let's think about our Muslim communities. Are they supportive spaces? Do I feel like I have a place to spiritually worship? Was my trauma associated with my religion? Do I have spiritual trauma that I'm working through? So thinking about that aspect as well. And then society, let's zoom out even more. So let's say that somebody is working through being sexually assaulted and they want to press charges and hold someone accountable. Is the legal system that supportive, right? What about power? What about privilege? Is society oppressive? So it's not just the person's brain that's experiencing the trauma and them as people, it's also all of these ecosystems that we live in. And so when somebody walks through your yoga studio doors and into your class, I almost imagine them bringing their ecological model with them. And so when we see triggers, that's why you, Mayuti, saying that it can be really hard to see triggers from happening because it can be really hard. Some of this stuff is not visible oftentimes. So, and then Safa saying, yeah, not a whole lot of supportive Muslim communities. So yes, absolutely not. So, which is unfortunate. So what I wanted to think about, yes, so the power that men have in misogyny, yes, it absolutely is, very much so. And that in itself is traumatic for individuals too. So what I thought we could do is think of two case studies and think about the ecological model. So we'll use sexual assault as one of them. So let's say a yoga student has experienced sexual assault and they're on their yoga mat. When you think about the ecological model, what are some things that they might be carrying with them from that model? And there's no right or wrong answer because it can manifest in many different ways. So Safa is saying guilt or shame with family's response to disclosure. Yes. So let's say somebody told their family and they didn't respond that well and they guilt or shame them. They're carrying that as part of their trauma onto their yoga mats. Yes. Yes. So Mayuti, you're saying family history of abuse. Absolutely. So let's say the family is the perpetrator and the people who are harmed, they're carrying that with them. Yeah, absolutely. Normalization of abuse, right? Yes. So they might be carrying the thoughts that this is how relationships happen and this is how families treat them. So that's showing up in the ecological experience of their trauma. And so this is the same slide. So exactly what you mentioned, may not have supportive communities, maybe seeking a community in a yoga studio, for example. Society, they may be dealing with the fact that survivors are often not believed over and over again. So they're dealing with that and bringing that into the yoga studio, right? So that can all manifest in terms of ecologically. And now this other example is a little different, very relevant to the, I think, US and Canada. So yoga student in your class has been a victim of police brutality while protesting. How might their trauma manifest ecologically? So let's think about the Bronfenbrenner model. So what could they be bringing onto their yoga mats from this? So it might help to, yeah, so Safa is saying loss of trust with anyone in a place of authority. Absolutely. So as individuals, they've experienced it, but then maybe societal wise, they're like, I don't trust anyone in a position of power and I'm triggered by that. Absolutely, because power. And then Mary, Mayuti, you're saying wouldn't want to be touched. Absolutely. So the individual trigger or trauma showing up is just not wanting to be touched or maybe flinching when somebody approaches them. Yes, and it could also be societally that many people of color do not trust white people anymore because of what they've gone through, and they only want to be around people of color. So that can definitely manifest, which could look like difficulty with mindfulness and physical awareness for asana. Yes, 100%. Aversion to light or loud music, bright light, yes. And that's something we'll talk a lot about in trauma-informed yoga, where dimming lights can be helpful. And then for some people, it's also triggering. So it's like, how can you balance that out? It can be really challenging. So all of what you shared is definitely on the table. Yes, it can be tricky to form perfect classes for people with different needs. So the goal of that was just to realize that we often see people as individuals on their mats and even walking around knowing that they've been through something. And there's also the fact that I often envision that they're carrying that ecological system with them. And so it can be really hard because you can't address that. And also it's like, this is complicated stuff, right? So maybe the focus of us as yoga instructors is breath. That simplifies things to something that is so powerful. And hopefully they can apply it to different parts of their life, because we're not going to be able to fix it for them. We're just going to be able to hold space for them. Okay, so that's the end of content stuff. I will leave space for questions and thoughts. I just wanted to summarize that we kind of defined trauma and went through the neurobiological stuff. We looked at it as an ecological model, and then we clarified some language about mental health. So that was a lot of foundational, I know non-yoga stuff, but I think it's important to know when we talk about trauma, what that means. Oh, go ahead, Safa.
Oh, nothing. I just unmuted
Okay.
myself because
Oh, cool.
gonna have to jump off soon, so I just want to make
Okay,
sure to say something.
cool. So I have 2 more dates because I looked ahead at my calendar. So part 2, I'm going to do Friday, August 21st. So 3 weeks from now, like
Yep.
after Eid. And then the final part will be Friday, September 4th. So I'm leaving about 2 to 3 weeks in between, and I can give you homework and readings to do if you really want to. But I'm hoping we can do education and give ourselves what we need between that time. So some questions to reflect on, you don't have to share now, but something to do before the next webinar is what aspects of trauma would you like to learn more about? And feel free to email me if you're looking for resources, because I can send them to you depending on what it is. And then focusing on trauma by people of color. Oh, Mayuti, I was saying that if there's anything related to trauma that you want to learn more about, that's something to think about, and you can email me if you're looking for resources. So if you're wanting to learn more about like the brain part, then I'll send you resources about that, for example. Yeah, you're welcome. And then people of color and trauma that they're going through, I think that's really important to learn more about, because I think we're going to be seeing more individuals coming to their mats with that. So that's something else to maybe think about. And I know it's different in the countries that we're in, so that's just something to think about. And then the final question is, as you're a yoga instructor, what could you being trauma informed look like? And you probably already are. What other things are you curious about in your own teaching? So that's something that you can reflect on and bring questions about, and that we can maybe brainstorm together as a group so that we're coming up with some answers and some ideas. Some readings. So Overcoming Trauma, this is an awesome book by David Emerson and Elizabeth Hopper. This was, and again, these books are all by white people. This is where trauma-informed yoga started, I think in the mid-90s. So it's an awesome practical book. And at the end, it has ways in terms of like how to teach poses that's different. So it gives you some really good practical tips. And then the second one is The Body Keeps the Score, Bessel van der Kolk. This is a pretty popular book. And it is basically everything that you will want to know about trauma. And there's a chapter on trauma-informed yoga, because he partnered with this guy, and they're the ones that did that trauma-informed yoga with people with chronic PTSD. So it's really good foundational information, and it's missing the people of color dimension, but I encourage you both to look online for practitioners who are people of color. There are a lot of them. The last book I don't have experience reading. I found it recently, and it looks like it provides a really good overview, so it might be something to look into. And there are lots of online articles. You don't even need to buy books necessarily. So yeah, that's it for me. I think I talked so much, but my contact information is there. Feel free to reach out, and I can email you both the registration link for the next class if you're able to make it, inshallah. And if not, then I'll just send you the recording. That's not a problem at all.
No, I'm gonna come for sure.
Okay, cool.
Thank you so much. I have to run out just because I have to go to work and get my kids. But
yes,
I will, inshallah, see you next time.
Sounds good. It's good to
Thank
see you,
you.
Safa. Take care. Assalamu alaikum.
It's nice to meet you,
Awesome.
Mayuti.
Awesome. You're welcome, Mayuti. Feel free to be in touch if you have any questions. You can email me, message me, and inshallah, this was helpful. Yeah, and I'll send you the PowerPoint as well so that you have it this weekend, inshallah. Awesome. Take care. Assalamu alaikum. Bye-bye.